for NSS support. So is anyone actually running NetWare? Good. Believe it or not, people are still using NetWare-based file systems, and they are a pain to restore from because it's quite proprietary and NetWare wouldn't let us access it without an agent. But we got there in the end. And yeah, so you can do the Linux level, Linux file level restore straight back to the original VM. There's quite a bit of intelligence about the way we do a file restore. If we try to restore a file and it exists, we're not going to overwrite it. If it is unlocked, we will rename it to original_file. If it is there but locked because it's in use by another process, we'll just rename the restored file to restored_file name. It's a fairly simple sort of bit of logic there, but it does work quite nicely. And it puts people at ease that you're not going to suddenly overwrite their data. Number 5. Did I mention that we didn't use any agents? It's a really big thing because I think it's probably one of the most underpinning sort of philosophies of how Veeam has developed, is that we're never going to do agents. They're not needed. We can do everything we need to do without them. And because we haven't got agents, we've got, it gives you a little bit more time for some fun things like bacon-related hygiene, bacon-related first aid, and I thought more appropriately for this, bacon-related drinking with some bacon-flavoured vodka. Number 4. In terms of the way you back virtual machines up, traditionally, you had a backup job or a backup policy, and you had to have the agent installed in order to do that. But if someone deployed a virtual machine or added a new server and they didn't tell you about it, well, it got left behind. And then suddenly you have a very awkward conversation where someone says, can I get a restore of my virtual machine? And the question comes back, which virtual machine? Oh no, never heard of it. And so, yeah, leaving a VM behind is definitely a bad thing. And we can get around that in a couple of ways. We can select our backups by container. So you can select a host or you can select an entire cluster. And anything that gets provisioned by that. So if you've got System Center provisioning VMs automatically, you can have those included automatically into a job. We also have a PowerShell API, so the scripters amongst you might be interested to know that you can start to orchestrate the addition of a job. If you've got an existing orchestrator workflow for your virtual machine provisioning, you can trip off a little script to add it to a backup job automatically, if you are running multi-cluster environment. Number 3, getting into the top 3 now, is our change block incremental. So, full incremental backup, so if you take a full backup of a VM, it's fine. But then if you need to do an incremental, you have to scan every block to see whether it has changed. And this can take quite a lot of time. In the VMware world, the facility to be able to use change block tracking is built into the API. However, with Hyper-V, we had to kind of go to the kitchen a little bit and bake our own. So we wrote a file system driver, and this driver essentially keeps a journal of changed data within VHD files. And that data is preserved even during, if you do a shared nothing live migration, that data stays with the VM. It also supports VMs, well, it doesn't matter where you've got them deployed, if they're on local storage, if they're on CSV, or if you're using some of the new clever SMB3 shares, that's all supported. You do have to add the SMB3 file server in, so that we're aware of it as a location. But it does essentially mean that your backups really are only just taking that changed data. So compared to a scan, what we call a scan and store type method, you're probably looking at saving sort of 10 times the backup speed on average, certainly with VMware. That's number 2, last 2, instant virtual machine recovery. Hans talked about this earlier, but it's really been our party trick since 2010. What it is it allows us to boot a virtual machine up directly from that compressed and deduplicated file. So you've got a backup file that contains the backups for 10 virtual machines. All that is just a block store, a number of blocks which, when assembled in the correct order, will turn into a virtual machine. All we do is have a file driver which knows which order to assemble those in. With VMware, we have to spoof an NFS mount. The nice thing about Hyper-V is we don't have to go via sort of any other NFS one. We can mount the data directly back to the host and get it started. Because we've also extracted the metadata, we restore the metadata like it's a real virtual machine, and then as the virtual machine boots up and requests blocks, we just serve those straight from the backup file. Part of the wizard that we use to restore that automatically assumes that you're going to migrate it into production. So as the VM's booting, you can also say start to restore to production, and it will initiate a storage migration from the backup file directly back to your production storage. So that even though a VM restore might take half an hour, the VM actually booted within the first 5 minutes of that half-hour restore period. So the service that you lost is now back up and running, albeit a little bit slowly for those first 25 minutes of it being running, but it's there. And then as soon as that's finished, it's up and operational back on your production storage. In version 7, we've added some extra functionality to this we've ported over from the VMware one, and that's virtual labs for Hyper-V. Told you about instant restore. Within instant restore, if we could instant restore those virtual machines into an isolated virtual network, then we can start to do some pretty clever things with them. Thanks to the network virtualization features of 2012, makes it a lot easier. This is something that we struggled with in 2008 to get the good network isolation. But it does allow us to start a VM isolated from the rest of the network, or multiple VMs, so you can look at doing an entire stack. This allows us to do 3 things. Firstly, is sure backup. Today, when you're doing backups, how often do you test restores? Anyone? Does anyone any backup happen to? How often do you think people would test restores? It's about once a quarter if they're good. Once every never sometimes.
And how we do it on a Saturday with pizza and Red Bull, right?
Yeah.
It's the only way how we do it. Or in Christmas weekends when no one's working. It's the only way to do it now.
Yeah. So you might pick a file random, which may or may not work, and then you've got to go back to the drawing board. But with this, we can start every virtual machine that we back up. We can actually test a restore, and we can do that automatically. So you back up overnight, and then you do your test restores during the day. They're isolated from the rest of the network. We test to see whether the VM heartbeat comes up. We can test to see whether it will ping and be available, if it would be available on the network, if you restored it back onto the production side. And we can go even one step further and start to test individual applications. So we can check for services starting if you've got dependencies. So an Exchange stack, you can start a domain controller up, you can start a front-end database up, and you can start a front-end CAS up, and you can start a mailbox database up, and eventually just test for that end-to-end connectivity. At the end of it all, it takes it all down, cleans up after itself, and sends you a nice email saying, testing all these machines, these ones failed, these ones passed. Now, if they failed, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be an indication of a wider problem. For example, on patching weekend, as you know, you all run Microsoft workloads, and they do need patching. Every OS needs patching. But frequently, when you patch, you do a reboot, and sometimes the VM doesn't come up after that reboot, and everyone blames the patch. So no, it's the patch. Well, in fact, it was the reboot, because there had been a problem that occurred way before you deployed a patch to it that was going to cause a blue screen. With this, that you know that it's going to blue screen long before you ever have to reboot the production VM, because you've effectively tested whether that VM is viable and that it will boot up successfully. So you save yourself that awkward 3 o'clock in the morning phone call during patching weekend when someone said, "Oh, actually, our application server didn't come back up. It must be the patching." Having to roll back. Whereas if you knew it was going to fail before it patched, well, you could probably patch it during the day or patch it at the time when you knew about it, rather than being caught by surprise. And it's really just reducing the level of surprises and nasty things that you get. If you do have to do recovery from applications that aren't SharePoint or Exchange, or if you don't just need an individual file out of the VM, we've got our application item recovery. So, using the same sort of technology, starting a number of virtual machines up in that lab. You can then publish individual IPs from that lab back to your production network on a different address. So let's say you have an Oracle stack, or any other sort of non-standard stack. Hans had an example of a mail server that uses...
So I run email on MySQL in a Linux environment.
A common one. I was running that yesterday. But you could publish either the external IP for the web service to it, or you could publish it so that your DBAs can connect with their own native tools. So the DBAs, let's face it, they don't like change. So they can use the tools they've been using to connect to their database, but to connect to their database as it was yesterday and put information out. And more featuring on the database level, the on-demand virtual lab. If you're trying to test a patch, wouldn't it be really good to go onto a website and say, actually I need these servers as of yesterday, please. And then eventually a little workflow can run, and you get an email back or a little pop-up from a desktop application saying, yeah, click here to connect to your virtual lab. And there is those 3 servers as they were running yesterday, talking to each other, and you can interact with those in a secure way. And when you finish with it, say, yeah, I'm done, and it gets deleted and cleaned all away. Well, that's basically the on-demand virtual lab, or on-demand sandbox, as it's known. It uses a workflow engine built into our Enterprise Manager front end, and it's all included with the product. There's nothing extra to buy once you've got this. So that was my top 10 of Hyper-V backup using Veeam backup and replication. Any particular questions? If there's nothing that I can't answer now, do please contact me on my email or on Twitter.
Will there also be a SQL explorer like what's Exchange and so on?
There is currently a UL wizard, so using the virtual lab for SQL, but it kind of depends on what you want to recover from SQL, because if you're recovering an individual table, then you actually want to recover all the dependencies of that, because if you then try and inject that back into your original database, you could end up with all sorts of consistency errors. What I would like to see is one that is more focused, actually like the DPM SQL Restore Wizard, where you're focused around the point in time, which DBAs probably want much more than individual items from within. And that's with my previous hats on as a SQL DBA, but that's what I would want.
If you go back one slide, these three features, are they unique to your Hyper-V support, or can you do the same for
you can do the same VMware. So
we already had them on VMware. We're just bringing them to Hyper-V because we now have. The problem was the network.
Yeah.
What we do, if it will allow me to 1 minute, is that if you have your subnet 10.0 and here's the main controller and an Exchange server, and I have my backup server in 11.0, right? I have my gateway that has 10.1 and 11.1. What we do is that we make a proxy appliance here, not a firewall, that has on this side 11. Doesn't matter 5, but it also has a masking range of 255.0. What we do is here we make a new switch that has on this side 10.1, so this is a 10.0 network. Exactly the same network that we had here. So we can just boot up, that's why we can just boot up the domain controller and the Exchange server like they were yesterday without changing anything. But with using the masking address, we can go to 255, so this is 10.5 and 10.9. We can go to 255.9 and going directly into the Exchange server. Okay, and that's how you can do that's how you can address directly going into your SQL. See, so this is the problem we did not manage to cover previously in Hyper-V. In VMware, we just created a new standard virtual switch on one of the hosts. We make a proxy appliance, combine them there. This is what we did not manage to do previously before Server 2012. That's how it's added now in version 7.
What he said.
I remember you're not restoring, right? You're running those machines from within the backup file, nothing changing.
Yeah. Actually, the very important point there is that we do have any writes that occur to those machines that are starting don't get stored back in the backup file, because while writing data back into a backup file after you backed it up would seem bad. So yeah, we do write those to temporary area. In the Hyper-V world, actually that temporary area is the area that you're then going to migrate the VM to. So it becomes a copy on write type process. So in fact, the longer that you run a backup off virtual lab, the faster it gets, because more and more of the data is being served from primary storage rather than from the backup itself, which of course is generally sitting on some cheap storage.
So you're using a differential disk for that?
Pass. I think so. I'll have to check.
Sounds like what you're doing. Sounds like what it is.
Well, that's basically what we do in VMware. VMware world is using a snapshot. and so any deltas from that snapshot go immediately into the
differential disk is similar to an ADHD snapshot.
It is transparent to the hypervisor. So while the hypervisor is so the virtual machine is running in the hypervisor, it doesn't know it's running on backup software. It also doesn't know that it has to write on another location.
I'm trying to remember for Hyper-V when I did my video for the. I hacked together a way of doing Linux file level recovery. For the
That might be different on Hyper-V because we're doing it through the NFS, not
you see
pointing VMware. Sorry.
But it does see them as a native PhD. Just with a path of some temp location on the backup server where we sort of publish the data, essentially the metadata of the PhD. Anyone else? Well, I realise you're only a few more steps between us and Veeam, so we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for listening.